A slap echoes to the Norfolk County Courthouse as Security Officer Parker strikes a quiet man in civilian clothes. Parker and his supervisor Jenkins smirk, thinking it's just another power trip against someone questioning their authority. The sound reverberates off marble walls as onlookers freeze in shock. Know your place, civilian. Jenkins sneers, straightening his tie with practiced arrogance. Security here's our business, not yours. The man barely flinches from the impact. His weathered face remains calm, eyes focused with intensity that momentarily makes Parker step back. There's something unsettling about his composure, the way he absorbs a blow like someone who's withstood far worse. Did you just assault a civilian in open court, Officer Parker? The man asks, his voice carrying a command presence that seems out of place with his simple button-down shirt and jeans. Jenkins laughs dismissively. You were interfering with official court security. Consider yourself lucky that's all you got. Lucky? The man reaches slowly into his pocket. I don't believe in luck. I believe in consequences. What the security officers don't know, Mason Reynolds isn't just any civilian. In minutes, their corrupt operation is about to face a reckoning they never anticipated. Mason Reynolds arrived at the courthouse just after 7 a.m., the Chesapeake Bay breeze carrying the familiar scent of salt water that reminded him of countless naval deployments. At 45, his athletic frame carried the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years in the most elite military operations while others ran from danger. As one of the most decorated Force Recon Marines in his unit's history, Mason had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq. His body bore the evidence. A slight limp from shrapnel wounds sustained during a rescue operation that earned him the Purple Heart, and a scar across his forearm where an enemy bullet had grazed him while he carried a wounded teammate to safety, an action that merited the Navy Cross. His team had respected him not because he demanded it, but because he'd earned it, saving lives, mentoring younger Marines, and standing firm when missions became seemingly impossible. Since retiring from active duty 3 years ago, Mason had dedicated himself to helping fellow veterans navigate civilian life, working with the Veterans Affairs Outreach Program. Today wasn't about war zones, though. He was here for James Wilson, a promising young veteran from his support group, facing disorderly conduct charges after a confrontation with court security. Something about James's case felt wrong, and Mason trusted his instincts. They'd saved lives before. Mason slipped into the courtroom wearing jeans and a Navy button-down. No uniform, no medals, just another civilian. Or so they thought. Mason chose a seat in the 3rd row, close enough to observe but not to intrude. Security officers Jenkins and Parker stood near the prosecution table, their postures radiating the casual arrogance of men who'd never faced real consequences. Mason had heard troubling whispers about them from other veterans. Excessive force complaints that mysteriously disappeared, veterans who suddenly changed their testimonies after private conversations. James sat with his public defender, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, looking nothing like the proud Army medic who'd saved lives under fire in Afghanistan. When Parker roughly grabbed James's arm during recess, Mason's jaw tightened. "Is that necessary, officer?" Mason asked, voice measured but firm. Jenkins's head snapped toward him, eyes narrowing. "Excuse me." "The young man is restrained and compliant," Mason said, standing slowly. "There's no need for additional force." Parker stepped closer, hand resting on his taser. "Who exactly are you?" "A concerned citizen," Mason replied. Jenkins's laugh was sharp. "Well, concerned citizen, mind your own business. You have no idea who you're dealing with." Mason stood his ground, noting the familiar intimidation tactics. "Actually, I believe it's you who doesn't understand who you're dealing with." Another entitled civilian, thinking they know better than security professionals. Jenkins mocked, moving closer. "Let me guess, you watched some cop shows and now you're an expert?" "I've seen enough real combat to recognize a bully," Mason replied evenly. The courtroom fell silent as Jenkins's face darkened with rage. "You people never learn, do you?" The slap came without warning, an open palm across Mason's face that echoed to the suddenly silent courtroom, leaving a red mark on his cheek. The line had been crossed. The war had just begun. The courtroom froze in collective shock. Mason's head had barely moved with the impact, as if he'd been braced for it. A thin red mark bloomed across his cheekbone, but his eyes, they burned with a calm intensity that made Parker involuntarily step back. "Did you just assault a civilian in open court, Officer Jenkins?" Mason asked, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly silent room. Jenkins smirked. "You were interfering with court security procedures." "Was I?" Mason reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open, revealing an ID and military credentials. Master Sergeant Mason Reynolds, United States Marine Corps, Force Recon, retired after 20 years of service. Purple Heart and Navy Cross recipient. The color drained from Jenkins's face. Parker's hand instinctively moved to his partner's arm. "That's impossible," Jenkins stammered. "You're not." "Not what, officer?" Mason's voice hardened. "Not in uniform? Not what you expected. Or not someone you thought would have the authority to report you." The judge leaned forward, his expression grave. "Master Sergeant Reynolds, would you like to file a formal complaint?" "I would." Mason turned to address the room, "and I believe several people here witnessed what happened." Phones were already out, recording. A court clerk nodded vigorously. "This is ridiculous," Parker interjected. "It was a misunderstanding. He was interfering with—" "I was questioning excessive force," Mason corrected. "Something your department has a documented history of ignoring with veterans. But today, that changes. This court will recess for 15 minutes, announced the judge, his gaze lingering on the red mark across Mason's face. As the room emptied, Jenkins and Parker huddled with their supervisor, Chief of Court Security Harmon, who'd been summoned from his office. Their whispers grew heated, punctuated by sharp glances toward the door. When Mason returned, the atmosphere shifted like air before a thunderstorm. He wore his full Marine Corps dress blue uniform, immaculate and imposing. Captain's bars gleamed on his shoulders. The Purple Heart and Navy Cross hung prominently on his chest alongside rows of service ribbons that told the story of a warrior who had seen the worst of humanity and still chose to serve. His previously casual posture was now military perfect. Spine straight, shoulders back, chin level. He wasn't alone. Behind him walked Thomas Harrington, Director of Veterans Affairs for Norfolk County, and a woman in a crisp suit who immediately approached the judge, credentials extended. "Your Honor, I'm Special Agent Catherine Wells, NCIS," she said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I'd like to formally enter these documents into evidence." Chief Harmon's face went ashen as she handed over a thick folder. "What is this?" the judge asked, flipping to the pages. "Evidence of a pattern, Your Honor," Mason said, stepping forward. For 3 years, multiple veterans have documented incidents involving officers Jenkins and Parker, excessive force during court appearances, intimidation of witnesses, target harassment of military personnel. Jenkins lunged forward. "That's a damn lie." "Officer," the judge's gavel cracked like a rifle shot. Mason continued, unflinching. "Veterans witness things security officers don't expect us to report. We've collected testimonies from 34 veterans, all documenting similar behavior." Harrington stepped forward. "We've tried addressing this through proper channels. Every complaint disappeared. Every witness was pressured to recant. Until today. Because today," Mason said, his eyes locked on Jenkins, "you picked the wrong Marine to slap." By noon, the courthouse had transformed into a storm center. NCIS agents moved to the halls with purpose, confiscating files and interviewing staff. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes reaching skyward like metal flowers seeking light. Inside the main courtroom, Mason sat straight back as Agent Wells laid out the evidence on a digital display for the judge and growing audience of officials. "This isn't just about 2 security officers," Wells explained, pulling up a network diagram. "We've identified a protection system that extends to the highest levels of court security." The diagram showed connections between Jenkins, Parker, and 4 other officers, all reporting to Chief Harmon, a man known for his political connections and tough on security rhetoric. Chief Harmon systematically buried complaints. Wells continued. Witnesses were intimidated, evidence disappeared, and veterans who spoke up found themselves facing trumped-up charges or enhanced sentences. A young bailiff stepped forward from the back of the room. "That's what happened to me," he said, voice shaking. "I reported Jenkins for roughing up a disabled veteran last year. Next day, I was reassigned to the basement filing room." His testimony broke the dam. 3 more court employees came forward, then a paralegal, then a court reporter, each with stories of corruption witnessed and silenced. Mason watched as the truth cascaded through the room, years of fear dissolving in minutes of courage. "There's more," Harrington said, producing a flash drive. Security camera footage that was supposedly corrupted during incidents. Our IT specialist recovered it from the system's backup server. The footage played on the screen. Jenkins planning contraband on veterans. Parker threatening witnesses, both laughing as they filed false reports. "This isn't just misconduct," the judge said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is criminal conspiracy." The threats began that night. First, a brick through Mason's living room window with a note, "Back off or bleed again, hero." Then anonymous calls to his office. By morning, his car's tires had been slashed, and someone had spray-painted "Traitor" across his garage door. "You should stay at a safe house," Director Harrington suggested during their emergency meeting. Mason shook his head. "If I run, everyone who came forward yesterday will think twice about standing their ground. Marines don't retreat under fire." The veteran community rallied around him. Former Marines took shifts watching his house. Members of his support group escorted him to and from work. When word spread about the intimidation, something unexpected happened. The community responded. Mrs. Thompson, whose son Mason had helped transition to civilian life after 3 traumatic tours, organized neighbors to clean the graffiti. Veterans from the local VFW post stood guard. Local businesses donated security cameras and reinforced doors. Meanwhile, the media storm intensified. What began as a local story about courthouse misconduct had exploded into national headlines. Decorated Marine exposes years of corruption against veterans with single act of courage. Mason's phone rang constantly with interview requests, but he declined them all. This wasn't about becoming a celebrity. It was about accountability. The resistance grew more desperate. An anonymous letter to the Veterans Affairs Department claimed Mason had falsified his service record. A fake social media account appeared posting doctor photos of him with known criminals. Someone filed a complaint alleging he'd threatened court personnel. "They're trying to destroy your credibility," Agent Wells warned during protection detail. Mason's expression remained resolute. "They can try, but there's a difference between me and them." He looked out the window at the gathering of supporters outside his home. "I'm not standing alone." The federal courthouse was packed beyond capacity for preliminary hearing. Journalists squeezed into every available space. Sketch artists perched on windowsills, and a line of veterans and supporters wrapped around the block, hoping for a glimpse of justice in action. At the prosecution table, U.S. Attorney Diana Lawrence arranged notes with methodical precision. Across the aisle, a team of defense lawyers surrounded Jenkins, Parker, and Harmon, who sat stone-faced in suits that couldn't hide what they truly were. Mason took the stand, the fluorescent lights highlighting the determination in his eyes. The red mark on his face had faded, but its impact had only grown stronger. "Master Sergeant Reynolds," Lawrence began, "please tell the court what happened that day." Mason recounted the events clearly, his voice steady. When he described the slap, several jurors visibly flinched. "And why did you decide to come forward with the additional evidence?" Mason looked directly at the defendants. "Because that slap wasn't about me. It was about power. It was about who they thought could be silenced and who couldn't." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his strategy clear. Attack his credibility. Question his motives. "Isn't it true you had a personal vendetta against court security?" "No," Mason replied. "I had a professional obligation to protect fellow veterans from abuse of power." "You've enjoyed the spotlight, haven't you? The hero Marine." Mason leaned forward. "There's nothing enjoyable about watching a system meant to protect people become a weapon against them. I didn't want attention. I wanted accountability." When asked about his military service, Mason spoke briefly of his deployments, but when pressed about his medals, he simply said, "I was just doing my duty as I am now." 3 months later, Mason stood in the VA office. pouring coffee for his veteran support group. The morning news played quietly. Harmon sentenced to 12 years, Jenkins and Parker to 8 years each. 42 cases involving veterans to be reviewed for misconduct. New civilian oversight board established for court security. They're calling you a hero again, Sarge. James said, now clear of all charges. Mason shook his head. I just did what anyone should do when they see something wrong. What any Marine would do. Later, alone in his office, he touched the spot where the slap had landed. That moment of pain had created ripples of change throughout the system. One act of courage had inspired others to find their own. The oversight board now included veterans representatives. The courthouse had implemented new training for security personnel on dealing with PTSD and combat trauma. Most importantly, veterans in the community walked taller, knowing someone had their back. At the next support group meeting, attendance had doubled. New faces appeared, veterans who'd previously been too intimidated to seek help. If Mason can stand up to those bullies, I can face my demons too, one newcomer explained. Mason kept the newspaper clippings not out of pride, but as a reminder, sometimes the most powerful act isn't charging into enemy fire. It's standing your ground when injustice comes to you. The Marines had taught him to fight for others. Now he'd taught an entire community to fight for themselves. What injustice would you confront if you knew others would stand with you? One person's courage can inspire a community. Remember, true heroes don't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they simply refuse to be silenced. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Like and subscribe for more stories of everyday courage.